Picture this: open Pacific. Nothing on the horizon for 500 miles in every direction. Below, a United States carrier strike group cuts through deep blue water, an aircraft carrier at the center, escorted by Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, their Aegis radar arrays turning slowly in the salt air. The sea itself is a deep, almost indigo blue at this latitude, and the only sound aboard the carrier's island is the low hum of electronics and the wind off the bow. From the outside, it looks like the most powerful naval formation on Earth, and it is. But somewhere out ahead, low and fast and almost invisible to conventional radar, a flight of Chinese J-20 stealth fighters is threading through the electromagnetic spectrum, hunting for a firing solution. This is the scenario every Pacific commander games out, not a fleet engagement with weeks of warning, not a satellite-tracked buildup with diplomatic cables flying. A short-notice ambush. Stealth fighters exploiting the gap between what radar can see and what it cannot, trying to get close enough to launch before anyone on the American side knows the geometry has already turned against them. Here's the question this scenario actually comes down to. Not who has the more advanced jet, not which missile has the longer range on paper, but something simpler and more brutal. Who sees who first? In modern air combat over open water, detection is not a preliminary step. Detection is the entire contest. The side that achieves it first has already won a significant portion of the fight before a single weapon leaves the rail. And the answer, when you run the actual numbers through what the US Navy has deployed in the Western Pacific right now, is not the one China's planners would want to hear. Let us walk through exactly how this plays out, layer by layer, minute by minute, and explain the machinery behind the outcome. To understand the J-20 ambush scenario, you have to understand what the J-20 was designed to do, and why it represents a genuinely serious challenge. The Chengdu J-20 is China's premier fifth-generation stealth fighter. It entered service with the People's Liberation Army Air Force in 2017, and by the mid-2020s, the PLAF operates it in meaningful numbers. Its airframe geometry, radar-absorbent coatings, and internal weapons bays are all engineered around one primary mission: staying invisible long enough to achieve offensive weapons release before the enemy can react. The J-20 is a large aircraft by fighter standards, longer than an F-22, with a distinctive canard delta configuration that trades some agility for range and internal fuel capacity. Its four-body design and carefully sculpted inlet geometry are optimized to minimize radar return from the frontal hemisphere, which is where the threat is in a beyond visual range engagement. The radar-absorbent coatings on its leading edges and control surfaces represent years of Chinese investment in low observable technology that had, for a generation, been the exclusive domain of American defense contractors. The J-20 carries the PL-15 Beyond Visual Range air-to-air missile, a weapon with an estimated range around 200 kilometers under favorable conditions. That range matters enormously. A J-20 pilot who can close to within that envelope before being detected has, in theory, already put the opposing aircraft in a nearly untenable position. The geometry becomes a deficit that no amount of flying skill can fully overcome. Now, consider what a flight of 4 to 6 J-20s doing exactly that would look like on radar. Against a legacy shipborne radar operating in conventional frequency bands, the J-20's radar cross-section is small enough that the contact would likely appear as noise. An ambiguous smear at the edge of detection range, exactly the kind of return that overworked operators flag as probable clutter and move on from. That is the J-20's designed advantage. And for a carrier strike group relying only on its surface radars and embarked fighters flying without airborne radar support, that advantage would be decisive. But the US Navy does not rely only on its surface radars. And that changes everything. The platform that breaks the J-20's ambush before it can mature is the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye. It is not a glamorous aircraft. It is a turboprop with a saucer-shaped radome spinning above its fuselage, and it looks nothing like the jets it works alongside. But the E-2D is arguably the most important asset in the entire carrier air wing for this specific scenario, because it carries the AN/APY-9 radar, an ultra-high frequency system specifically engineered to detect low observable targets at long range. The E-2D orbits at altitude, which matters. Radar works on line-of-sight geometry, and altitude extends that line of sight dramatically. An E-2D operating at 20,000 feet plus can push its detection cone hundreds of miles ahead of the strike group, looking into the airspace where the J-20s are trying to stay hidden. The AN/AP-9 uses adaptive processing. It does not simply paint a picture, it hunts through the noise for the faint, inconsistent returns that a stealth aircraft leaves behind when it moves through air. Here's what nobody expected when the E-2D generation was fielded. The UHF radar band, which the Hawkeye uses, is particularly problematic for stealth coatings optimized against higher frequency threats. A jet shaped to minimize its signature against X-band fire control radars may present a meaningfully larger return in UHF. The J-20's designers knew this, but there is no clean engineering solution. You cannot optimize a single airframe against every frequency simultaneously without compromising the very geometry that makes it stealthy in the first place, so the J-20 flight closes. The pilots are running low and fast, trying to stay below the radar horizon, timing their ingress against what they believe is the strike group's sensor coverage. What they do not know, cannot know until it is too late to change the geometry, is that an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye has been orbiting at altitude 200 miles ahead of the carrier for the past 3 hours, and it picked up faint, intermittent returns consistent with stealthy fast movers 40 minutes ago. Inside the E-2D's cabin, the scene is less dramatic than you might imagine. 3 operators sit at their consoles in near darkness, the glow of their displays casting pale light across their faces. The returns that caught their attention are barely distinguishable from the background. A slightly elevated noise floor and a narrow azimuth slice, returns that appear and disappear over successive scans rather than holding the steady presence of a surface vessel or a commercial airliner. One operator has bracketed the area with a cursor and flagged it for correlation. The others are watching the same sector, running the adaptive processing algorithms harder, trying to coax more signal out of what might be nothing. That is the obstacle the J-20 ambush runs into first, and it is the one the entire scenario hinges on. The Hawkeye's operators cannot immediately classify what they are seeing. The returns are ambiguous. There is a period, call it 15 minutes, where the tactical picture is genuinely uncertain, where the operators are trying to determine whether they have noise or a real contact, and where the wrong call in either direction carries serious consequences. Call it noise and dismiss it. You may be handing the J-20s the first shot opportunity their pilots are counting on. Call it a threat and scramble the air wing against a false alarm. You have burned fuel, exposed your fighters, and told any real ambush exactly where your defensive screen is. What is most surprising about this particular problem is not the radar physics. It is how the US Navy has chosen to solve the human side of it. The E-2D does not operate in isolation. It data links everything it sees. Raw returns, track files, ambiguous contacts, the whole tactical picture, directly to the carrier's Combat Direction Center and simultaneously to every Arleigh Burke-class destroyer in the strike group. Every Aegis system in the formation is watching the same picture the Hawkeye operators are watching in real time, with millisecond latency. The decision about whether that ambiguous return is a threat is not made by one exhausted operator at 20,000 feet. It is made by a network. While that network is working, the classification problem, the carrier has already begun its response. Standing doctrine for a carrier strike group in a contested environment is not to wait for confirmation before acting. It is to begin posturing for the worst case while the intelligence picture develops. The carrier turns into the wind. Flight operations that were scheduled go to standby. The alert F-35C is on deck. Typically 2 to 4 on 5-minute alert in a heightened threat environment. Receive the order to launch, not to prosecute a target. Not yet. To establish a stealth screen between the strike group and the direction of the ambiguous contacts, and to use their own AN/APW6 radar and passive sensors to help classify what the Hawkeye is seeing from a different angle. The launch sequence is a practiced exercise in controlled urgency. Deck crews in color-coded jerseys move with the economy of motion that only comes from thousands of repetitions. The catapult officer signals. Steam pressure builds. Within minutes, the F-35Cs are climbing through low overcast, checking in with the E-2D on a secure data link frequency, receiving the ambiguous track data, and beginning to vector toward the uncertain contact bearing. The F-35C has something important that its predecessors did not. It can operate its active, electronically scanned array radar in a mode that is extremely difficult to detect, using low probability of intercept waveforms that spread radar energy across a wide band rather than broadcasting on a single frequency. A J-20 equipped with its radar warning receiver is listening for exactly the kind of radar emissions that would betray an oncoming fighter. The F-35C can interrogate the airspace ahead of it without announcing its own presence. So the two stealthy types are now feeling for each other in the electromagnetic dark, and the F-35 is doing it with a network picture from the Hawkeye that the J-20 pilots do not have. This is the first moment where the networked architecture begins to tell. The J-20 is a capable aircraft with a capable sensor suite. But the J-20 pilot is working largely alone. His ground control intercept picture, fed from over-the-horizon radar systems on the Chinese mainland or from surveillance assets in the theater, becomes degraded the further west the J-20 flies. At several hundred miles over open Pacific water, the data link latency increases, the picture becomes stale, and the J-20 pilot is increasingly relying on what his own sensors can find, which means he is looking for the carrier. And to find the carrier, he may need to illuminate it with his own radar, which means transmitting. Put yourself in that J-20 cockpit for a second. You have crossed 700 miles of open ocean at low altitude. Fuel is becoming a planning factor. Your targeting picture from home is 30 seconds old and getting older. And somewhere ahead of you is a carrier strike group that you know operates E-2Ds and F-35Cs. The question running through your mind is the same question every ambush pilot has faced in the history of aerial combat. Did they see me first? The temptation to go active with your radar, to get a clean picture, to know where the target actually is not poor discipline. It is the rational response to genuine uncertainty. Without a targeting solution, the PL-15S in your internal bays are dead weight. But the moment you transmit, you hand the other side a passive detection fix that their network will distribute to every shooter in the formation before your radar sweep even completes. By the time the E-2D's track picture firms up, and in this scenario, that happens when one of the J-20s activates its PD-10 fire control radar for what its pilot intends to be a quick-ranging sweep. The entire US response accelerates to a different tempo. The radar emission is passive detected by the F-35Cs ahead of the strike group and simultaneously by the AN/SPY-6 radar on the lead Arleigh Burke. The emission lasts 3 seconds. It is enough. The track file upgrades from ambiguous contact to probable hostile. The picture flows across the data link to every shooter in the formation. And now the geometry the J-20 pilots were counting on, the ambush positioning, the first shot advantage, has been handed to the other side. Here is what happens in the next 4 minutes. The F-35Cs, already positioned between the J-20 flight and the carrier, receive the targeting data from the Hawkeye and slave their weapon systems to the track files. They do not need to illuminate the J-20s with their own radar to shoot. The network has already done the targeting work. The AIM-120D AMRAAM, the primary beyond visual range weapon aboard the F-35C, has its own active radar seeker that activates in the terminal phase. The F-35 pilot launches against a network track, and the missile finds the target on its own. Meanwhile, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer 20 miles astern of the carrier has been given the same picture. Its AN/SPY-6 radar has independently tracked the J-20s since the emission was detected, and it is cooing SM-6 interceptors on its vertical launch system. The SM-6 is not a short-range point defense weapon. It is a long-range, maneuverable interceptor with a dual-mode seeker and a range that makes it relevant at the distances involved in this scenario. The destroyer is not a last resort. It is a second shooter running a parallel intercept track against the same targets, creating a problem the J-20 pilots cannot solve by maneuvering against one of them. And then there is the EA-18G Growler. The Growler is the least visually dramatic aircraft in this story and probably the most tactically decisive one. An F/A-18 Super Hornet airframe rebuilt around electronic warfare, the EA-18G Growler exists to do one thing better than any other aircraft in the world: reach into an enemy's sensor network and blind it. The Growler carries the AN/ALQ-99 jamming system, banks of transmitters capable of radiating across a wide range of frequency bands simultaneously, with enough power to saturate the receiver front ends of radar systems at tactically significant distances. In this scenario, a Growler has been airborne since before the alert launch, orbiting behind the F-35C screen, and when the track file firms up, it begins active jamming of the frequency bands the J-20's radar uses for tracking and target acquisition. The J-20 pilots are now receiving fragmented, degraded radar returns. Their own sensors are fighting through interference. The PL-15 missiles they plan to launch need a targeting solution, and the EA-18G Growler is systematically denying them a clean one. A missile launched into jamming is not a wasted shot, but it is a far less certain one. The probability of hit drops. And in a scenario where the J-20 flight was counting on a first shot advantage that it has now lost, a reduced probability shot is the difference between an ambush and a losing engagement. The J-20 in this scenario is not a bad aircraft. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The question is whether the design assumptions it was built on, that stealth provides sufficient first detection advantage to negate a networked opponent, hold up against the specific combination of systems the US Navy has assembled. When you run the physics of the E-2D's radar against the J-20's cross-section and add the Growler's jamming to the J-20's targeting problem, and account for the data link architecture that gives every US shooter the same picture simultaneously, the J-20's designed advantage is real but narrower than its designers needed it to be. Here's the part that does not sit right, even after working through all of it. The scenario we walked through assumes everything in the US system works. The E-2D picks up the ambiguous returns, and the operators correctly flag them instead of dismissing them as clutter. The data link propagates the track files without degradation. The F-35Cs are positioned correctly for the intercept geometry. The Growler is on station, and its jamming is effective against the specific radar modes the J-20 is using. The SM-6 interceptors are within engagement range. In a real engagement, some of those assumptions will fail. Not all of them, but some. An operator on hour 6 of a 12-hour patrol misses the first ambiguous return, and the J-20's close an additional 40 miles before the track firms up. A data link dropout lasts 90 seconds, and 2 of the F-35Cs are working an old picture. One of the SM-6 interceptors has a guidance failure in terminal phase and misses. The Growler's jamming is effective against 3 of the 4 J-20s, and the 4th gets a clean enough picture to launch. These are not hypotheticals introduced to be pessimistic. They are the actual variants that every naval planner accounts for when they wargame this scenario. The US Navy's layered architecture is designed with exactly this variance in mind. If one layer develops a gap, the next layer covers it. The Hawkeye misses, and the F-35 catches it. The F-35 engagement is degraded, and the SM-6 backstop fires. The SM-6 misses, and the carrier's close-in systems engage. But each time a layer has to compensate for the one before it, the geometry gets tighter, and the margin for the next layer shrinks. It is worth dwelling on what that compression actually looks like from inside the Combat Direction Center aboard the carrier. The spaces are tight, the lighting is dim red, and every console displays a slightly different slice of the same overall picture. Watch officers move between stations, correlating information, issuing orders in clipped, precise language over intercom circuits. The speed of events in the terminal phase of an air engagement is such that human decision cycles can barely keep pace, which is precisely why the architecture is designed to push as much engagement automation as possible into the weapon systems themselves. The SM-6 does not wait for a human to press a button in terminal phase. The AIM-120D Seeker does not ask for permission to acquire. The system is built to operate at machine speed because the engagement unfolds at machine speed. Here is the honest read on this scenario after working through the systems and the physics. The US Navy's networked architecture, the combination of E-2D Advanced Hawkeye, F-35C, EA-18G Growler, and Arleigh Burke with Aegis and SM-6, represents a genuine, tested, integrated answer to the J-20 ambush problem. The math of who sees who first, when you account for the Hawkeye's detection reach and the network's ability to share that picture instantaneously, favors the American side across most of the parameter space. But the margin is not comfortable, and it is not static. China knows exactly what the E-2D does and why it matters. The PLA's investment in long-range anti-radiation missiles capable of targeting airborne radar platforms and in jamming systems designed to degrade data link communications is a direct engineering response to the US Navy's networked architecture. The contest is not between a J-20 and an F-35. It is between 2 evolving networks and the side that maintains the edge in network resilience. The ability to keep the picture flowing when the other side is actively trying to break it is the side that wins the next version of this scenario. China's YJ-91 and newer anti-radiation missile developments are not accidental procurement decisions. They are a logical response to the recognition that the E-2D is the keystone of the US defensive architecture in this scenario. Remove the Hawkeye or degrade its ability to maintain a coherent data link with the rest of the formation, and the layered picture that defeated the J-20 ambush begins to fragment. This is the arms race that does not show up in headlines about stealth fighters and carrier strike groups, but it is the one that matters most to the outcome of the scenario we have described. What does this tell us about the balance of power in the Pacific right now? A few things worth sitting with. Stealth alone is not sufficient. The J-20 is stealthy, but stealth is a spectrum, not a binary, and against a purpose-built airborne radar running the right frequency, the J-20's designed cross-section reduction does not provide the margin of invisibility its designers counted on. The lesson: that no single platform capability, however impressive, substitutes for system-level integration, is one the US Navy internalized after the Cold War and has been building against ever since. The carrier strike group's defensive depth is real. The scenario we walked through involved 3 distinct engagement layers: the F-35C screen, the SM-6 backstop, and the electronic warfare suppression from the EA-18G Growler, all operating simultaneously against the same threat axis. A J-20 flight that defeats one layer faces the next. The probability of defeating all 3, in sequence, under jamming, while fuel is a planning factor and the network picture is degraded, is low enough that the scenario ends in a way the Chinese planners did not want. Numbers matter in ways that complicate simple comparisons. A carrier strike group at sea typically operates with multiple Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, multiple E-2Ds flying in rotation, multiple F-35C alert sections, and multiple EA-18G Growlers. The J-20 flight in this scenario is operating at the limit of its unrefueled range, constrained by fuel state, constrained by a degrading data link picture from home, constrained by the jamming environment the Growler has created. The asymmetry is not just in technology. It is in the operational context each platform is working inside. The J-20 ambush scenario is most dangerous, not in the open Pacific, where the E-2D's range and the strike group's depth have room to work, but in the littorals, the constrained waters near island chains, where the geometry compresses, where the Hawkeye's detection cone is cluttered by land returns, where the data link architecture has to work harder to maintain the picture. In that environment, the margins discussed above narrow considerably. The same networked architecture that wins comfortably in open water becomes a harder fight when the geometry compresses and the adversary has land-based radar and missile systems supplementing what the J-20 is doing independently. In the first island chain environment specifically, the arc running from Japan through the Ryukyus, Taiwan, and the Philippines, the J-20 is not operating at the end of a 700-mile overwater transit. It may be operating within easy reach of land-based tankers that can extend its endurance, land-based over-the-horizon radars that can supplement its targeting picture, and land-based surface-to-air missile batteries that can complicate the F-35C's freedom of maneuver. The geometry that favors the networked U.S. architecture in open water begins to look much more contested when the J-20 is fighting inside its own sensor web rather than outside it. The U.S. Navy knows this. It is part of why the service has invested heavily in distributed maritime operations concepts. The idea that the strike group's combat power can be disaggregated, spread across more dispersed platforms, making the targeting problem for the adversary harder even in constrained geometry. Whether that concept works as advertised at the speed and scale of a real conflict in the Western Pacific is a question that cannot be answered in a wargame. It can only be answered in the event nobody wants to see happen. The one detail that stuck with me going through all of this is the E-2D's role in the outcome. Not the F-35, not the SM-6, not the Growler, the turboprop with the spinning radar dish, the unglamorous aircraft that has been orbiting at altitude for 3 hours before anyone fired anything, quietly building the picture that made everything else possible. In a world obsessed with stealth fighters and hypersonic missiles and carrier-striking ballistic weapons, the platform that actually defeats the J-20 ambush in this scenario is an airborne radar that has been in service, in various versions, since 1964. That is not an accident. It is a design philosophy, that the outcome of an air battle is determined less by who has the most impressive individual platform and more by who has the best integrated picture of the battle space before the shooting starts. The U.S. Navy has built its Pacific posture around that philosophy, layer by layer, for decades. The J-20 is a serious aircraft with serious capabilities, and China's investment in stealth, long-range missiles, and electronic warfare represents a genuine and growing challenge to that posture. But in the scenario we walked through today, an ambush in open water against a carrier strike group operating its full layered architecture, the math of detection and networked engagement answers the stealth edge before it can be decisive. Does that hold as the geometry changes, as China's sensor architecture expands further into the Pacific, and as the PLA's investment in anti-radiation missiles and data link jamming matures? That is the harder question, and one we will be coming back to in the next breakdown. Drop a comment. Is China's real advantage the J-20 itself? Or is it the land-based sensor and missile network that the J-20 operates inside? And does that change your read on how this fight goes if it happens closer to the Chinese coastline? We read every one. If you want to understand the weapon that complicates this picture most, the DF-21D and DF-26 carrier-striking ballistic missiles that force the carrier to stay further from the fight in the first place. That breakdown is next.